For months, Pam Bondi stood in front of cameras as one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. Behind closed doors, under oath, she told a different story. She said she didn't really run the Epstein files investigation. She said that was Todd Blanche's job. And when lawmakers pressed further, she pointed at Kash Patel too. The problem? People inside her own department say that's not true, and there's a memo with her signature on it that says otherwise. This is the moment the official story cracked. Not from a leak. Not from a whistleblower. From Bondi herself in her own testimony. Here's exactly what she admitted, why it contradicts her own department's paper trail, and why the person she just threw under the bus might be about to return the favor. Let's lay out the timeline so you can see exactly how we got to this moment. Back in November, Attorney General Pam Bondi stood at a DOJ podium next to her deputy, Todd Blanche, and FBI Director Kash Patel, defending how the department was handling the Epstein files. The message was confident. Everything was under control. Redactions were about protecting victims. More would come. Congress had already passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act with a hard December 19th deadline. When that day came, the DOJ released hundreds of thousands of pages, but heavily redacted, and lawmakers from both parties said it didn't meet what the law required. Two lawmakers, Republican Thomas Massie and Democrat Ro Khanna, immediately started building a bipartisan push for contempt. Blanche's public response was dismissive. He said he wasn't taking the threat seriously. Then, in April, everything changed. President Trump fired Bondi as Attorney General. Days later, she was scheduled for a deposition before the House Oversight Committee, and she skipped it, arguing the subpoena applied to her role as Attorney General, a job she no longer held. Oversight Democrats weren't having it. They filed a civil contempt resolution against her for defying a legally binding subpoena. Less than an hour after that contempt resolution went public, Republicans announced a new date. Bondi would testify on May 29th. That interview is where this story turns into something else entirely. In that closed-door session, under oath, Bondi didn't defend the department's handling of the files. She distanced herself from it. According to members who were in the room, she told the committee that Blanche was managing what she called the entire investigation. When pressed further, she also repeatedly redirected blame toward Patel, framing decisions about which documents got released as something that ran through him, not her. Think about what that actually means. This is the person who, months earlier, stood at a podium as the Attorney General of the United States, the top law enforcement official in the country, now telling Congress, under oath, that she wasn't really the one steering the biggest legal transparency fight of her tenure. That's not a minor detail. That's one of the most powerful people in the federal government admitting, on the record, that she was more of a spectator than the decision-maker in a case that involves survivors, redacted documents, and the president's own associates. Here's where it gets messy for Bondi. Current and former Justice Department officials, speaking anonymously about internal conversations, directly disputed her account. They said Bondi wasn't just informed of what was happening, she signed off on every major decision along the way. That includes, according to these officials, a memo from July 2025 that formally closed out the government's review of the Epstein files. If that's accurate, it means the person now telling Congress she wasn't in the driver's seat is the same person whose signature ended the entire review process months earlier. You can't simultaneously be the official who closed the investigation and the bystander who had nothing to do with how it was run. And then there's the detail that makes this even stranger. Shortly after leaving that interview, Bondi posted publicly praising Blanche's handling of the Epstein case, calling it a Herculean task and describing him as doing an incredible job. Read that again. Hours after telling Congress that Blanche was the one really running the investigation, distancing herself from any responsibility, she publicly praised him for doing exactly the job she just said wasn't hers. That's not the behavior of someone genuinely trying to clear her name. That's the behavior of someone trying to have it both ways, deflect blame in private testimony, protect the relationship in public. Now let's talk about who this actually hits. Blanche isn't just an ex-colleague Bondi named in passing. He's now the acting Attorney General, the person running the entire Justice Department. And he's the same person Bondi just told Congress was really steering the Epstein files decisions all along. Every subpoena his DOJ processes right now, every redaction call his department defends, is being made by a man his own former boss just testified was the real decision-maker on the most scrutinized document release of the year. If Bondi's account holds up, Blanche doesn't get to say he was just following her direction because she just said the opposite. Patel hasn't testified publicly about this specific claim yet, but he's now been named, under oath, by his own former boss as someone with real influence over which documents got released. That puts him in a position where lawmakers now have a direct reason to bring him in and ask him to respond to Bondi's version of events under oath, on the record. And then there are the Epstein survivors and their legal teams. For the people who've waited years for straight answers, this is exactly the kind of moment that should feel like progress and instead feels like more of the same. Another official passed responsibility down the chain instead of answering directly. Every month spent sorting out who's telling the truth about who made which redaction call is another month survivors don't have the transparency Congress already legislated. Here's what's getting lost in the coverage. This isn't really a story about Bondi anymore. It's a story about what happens when the person who now runs the DOJ was just accused, by his own former boss, of being the one actually responsible for the decisions under scrutiny. Blanche can't simply move on from this the way officials usually do when a predecessor makes news. He inherited the office, and now he's inherited the specific claim that he, not Bondi, was the one calling the shots on Epstein files redactions. If that claim gains traction, it doesn't stay in the past. It becomes a live question about the current acting Attorney General's own judgment, sitting right on his desk. And that raises the question nobody in Washington wants to ask directly. If Bondi couldn't survive this fight while sitting in that chair, what happens to Blanche now that the finger is pointed at him from the chair he just moved into? So what's actually changed here? First, officials are starting to testify against each other, not just defend the department as a unit. For most of this saga, Bondi, Blanche, and Patel presented a united front. That ended the moment Bondi, under oath, put daylight between herself and the other two. Once one official breaks from the group narrative, it becomes much harder for everyone else to hold the same line. Second, public statements now have a much shorter shelf life. Blanche's confident dismissal of contempt threats last year didn't anticipate his own former boss naming him as the real decision-maker in sworn testimony months later. Officials are learning that what plays well in a press conference doesn't necessarily survive a congressional deposition. Third, signing off is becoming the new standard for accountability. The DOJ officials disputing Bondi's account didn't argue about intent. They pointed to a specific memo with her name on it. That's a much harder thing to explain away than a verbal recollection of who managed what. Now let's talk about the ripple effects spreading quietly through Washington. Congressional investigators now have a roadmap. Bondi's testimony effectively handed lawmakers a new set of questions to put directly to Blanche and Patel. Expect renewed subpoena pressure aimed at both, built specifically around reconciling their account with hers. DOJ officials are quietly reviewing their own paper trails. Any career staffer who worked on redaction decisions now has extra reason to make sure their own record is clean and documented, given that the two most senior officials in the chain are now contradicting each other about who is responsible for what. Legal teams representing all three officials are recalculating. When your client's former boss just told Congress the decisions were really yours, your legal strategy changes. Expect quieter, more defensive public postures from everyone named in this testimony going forward. Here's what's being missed entirely. Everyone's focused on whether Bondi was telling the truth. The more important question is whether Blanche, now running the department, can credibly investigate or defend decisions that his own predecessor just testified were fundamentally his to begin with. Bondi's public praise of Blanche right after distancing herself from him in testimony isn't a contradiction people are talking about enough. It suggests this may be less about factual accuracy and more about managing personal legal exposure while preserving political relationships, a dynamic that tells you more about how accountability actually works at this level than any single admission does. And survivors' advocates have said plainly, over and over, that every month spent on who said what is a month without real transparency. That part of the story won't trend the way Bondi threw Patel under the bus does, but it's the part that matters most once this news cycle passes. So, where does this go from here? There are three ways this plays out. Scenario 1. Blanche and Patel are forced to testify and directly respond to Bondi's account. Congress uses her testimony as leverage to compel both men to answer under oath, creating a direct, on-record conflict between three former colleagues. This is roughly 35% likely lawmakers already have a clear motive, and Bondi's testimony gives them a specific, quotable reason to push for it. Scenario 2. The dispute stays unresolved and fades into procedural back and forth. Officials issue statements through spokespeople, nothing gets directly reconciled, and the story becomes background noise as other developments take over the news cycle. This is roughly 45% likely. It's the most common outcome for conflicting sworn accounts among former colleagues. Without a forcing mechanism like a subpoena deadline, these disputes often just sit. Scenario 3. Blanche's position becomes politically untenable. If more evidence emerges supporting Bondi's account, pressure builds for Blanche to step aside from decisions related to the Epstein files specifically, or he faces renewed calls for his own testimony under a formal subpoena. This is roughly 20% likely. It would require the signed memo, or something like it, to become public and specific enough to be undeniable. Right now, the pattern points toward Scenario 1 gaining momentum, given how quickly lawmakers moved after her previous contempt fight. Watch for the next subpoena announcement. That's the clearest signal. Here's what to watch next. Watch whether House Oversight issues new subpoenas for Blanche or Patel, specifically referencing Bondi's testimony. That's the clearest sign Scenario 1 is unfolding. Watch whether the DOJ's public statements about Blanche's role shift at all in the coming weeks. A change in language from his office is often the first sign of internal legal strategy shifting. And watch whether that July 2025 memo becomes a bigger part of the public conversation. If officials keep bringing it up, that's a signal it's the central piece of evidence this entire dispute may hinge on. Pam Bondi spent months as the public face of the DOJ's handling of the Epstein files. Under oath, she told Congress that face didn't reflect who was actually making the decisions. Whether that's true or a convenient way to manage her own legal exposure is exactly what Congress is going to spend the next several months trying to figure out. But one thing is already clear: the united front three officials presented at that November press conference is gone. And the man now running the Justice Department has just been named, by his own former boss, as the one who was really in charge all along. I'll keep tracking this as new subpoenas, statements, and documents come out, because this is exactly the kind of story where the next update changes everything. If you want to see it the moment it breaks, subscribe. I'll be breaking down every development as it happens.